Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a 1930s evening gown. Earlier this year, I made a 1930s girdle to go underneath this, and now, since we have the foundation already done, I'm going to make the actual dress to go over it. But before we get into the sewing part, let's talk a little bit about 1930s fashion and what evening gowns in this era looked like. The gown I'm going to be making is specifically from 1934, and that is kind of at the tail edge of the first half, because there's two very distinct styles going on in the 1930s. The first half of the 1930s is very different from the later half, whereas the first half is very flowy, feminine, and a lot of bias and very drapey and slinky. The second half has a lot more structure to it, and that era starts already building out the sleeves, having structured shoulder pads, and a lot more structure and tailoring to it to begin with. Less slinkiness, less bias, flowiness. And because I'm going to be making a 1934 dress, that is at the very tail end of that slinky, flowy style. That continues to some degree in evening gowns, but it does become more structured after that. Even though we might associate the 1920s with women's liberation, but in fashion, actually, I would say that the biggest liberation actually happens during the 1930s. Because though we have had low-cut necklines certainly before, in the 1930s, we get a huge amount of back cleavage, much more than we have ever previously seen. And also, for the first time, undergarments are being made very specifically for different sort of gowns that require different sort of underwear, where you can't wear your regular underwear because otherwise it would show. And also with the rise of pants as women's garments, that also kind of signifies that change from where the girdle is worn basically almost with every outfit by most women to something that isn't necessarily worn daily, even though most women do wear it, at least to certain occasions. And in the early part of the 1930s, we start seeing a lot of backless gowns. First in evening wear, because evening wear has always been more provocative than daytime wear. So we start seeing these evening gowns that are completely backless, the back goes all the way up to the waist. And of course, we need a bra under that. And that's where the Kestos bra comes in. This was actually invented already in the later part of the 1920s, and it was useful for some of the lower backed 1920s gowns, but it really came to its own during the 1930s. But during the 1940s, the backless gown kind of disappears from fashion, so the Kestos bra kind of goes away with that. Though there's so many backless evening gowns in the 1930s, there definitely are evening gowns in the 30s that still have a higher neck both in front and back, and that aren't very provocative and showy. Though they do tend to have that bias slinkiness or just slinky materials, so that it does provide that curve hugging silhouette anyways, even if it's not actually showing that much skin. And that to some degree kind of helped the girdle stay around, because if you're wearing really slinky clothing that is going to hug every single curve, and you want smooth lines, because that was definitely the fashion, unless you're very young and very naturally the right shape for whatever the fashion was at the time, you're most likely going to need a little help to provide those smooth lines that are in the fashionable shape, because girdles do provide quite a bit of illusion of those correct curves. Because again, it's not about body size, it is about the illusion of the correct silhouette. But though bias cut was very popular in the 1930s, there are plenty of dresses, like actually the one I'm using, that aren't actually mostly made in the bias. But they utilize different sort of materials like crepes, satins, and especially crepeback satins, and then really, really slinky silk and rayon velvets that kind of give that illusion and that sort of flowy, heavy drape to it that provides basically the same sort of effect that really hugs the curves as would a bias cut. Because after the short hems and the sort of boxy look of the 1920s, we really go to the other opposite. So very like heavy, long, droopy, but slender lines. You want curves, but you want them to feel slender. So basically you want the curves to happen gradually. So no like strict lines. You don't want that Victorian like strict sharp hourglass. You want soft curves. That's the 1930s silhouette. And like I said, a lot of evening gowns throughout the 1930s wear backless. And this kind of transferred also to daytime fashion. And there's actually a lot of examples, especially things that are considered sportswear. So not necessarily for sporting activities, more what we would call athleisure wear nowadays. That sort of garments, oftentimes, especially summer garments, were backless. I'm going to be using a linen lace knit fabric for my outer fabric. So because it's see-through, it of course needs another fabric underneath. It needs a lining dress. And I'm going to be doing it separate, which is very common in the 1930s. Most gowns that were made out of lacy materials, something that would be see-through or have see-through areas to it, usually had a separate underdress to it. They could sometimes have the lining dress attached, but it was more common for those to be separate, simply because that gave you more options for mixing and matching. And that's what I'm going to do here also. But also that gives me the option of this cotton voile underdress that I can use this as like a fancy nightgown, which was very common in the era. Like you see a lot of evening gown like patterns or even evening gown patterns used for night dresses. We oftentimes tend to think of the past as being super conservative, but especially 1930s evening gowns with their open backs and illusion naked look and slinky lines. Definitely the past wasn't always super conservative. That idea comes more from people as they age, or at least previous generations as they've aged. They've tended to become more conservative with age. And that is one of the big reasons why we get this idea of the past being much more conservative than it actually was. The pattern I'll be using is a reproduction pattern that is graded to several different sizes by overdress, and it is on Etsy. I'll link it down below. And the great thing about this type of graded patterns is that because the pattern block, the body block, what they used originally for these patterns is a B cup. And because I'm significantly larger than a B cup, I can alter the pattern using the grade lines and mixing and matching pieces so that I can get it to be fairly close to what my measurements actually are without having to actually alter the whole pattern all that much. So I get away with a lot less work that way.
So I'm somewhat in between sizes, so I will be doing some clever cutting. So these skirt pieces I will cut mostly on the size 20 because that fits my hip, and then just slightly curving in towards the waist because the waist is going to be smaller. And then these waist pieces I'm going to be using the size 14 because that's my waist size, and then I'll just gather these in these skirt pieces to match the waist. And then for the back I will be using the size 16, and then for the front I'll be using the size 20. So this compensates for me having a much larger bust than a B cup.
After we reach hip level, cutting to the size 20, I cut at an angle towards the smaller size that matches my waist, making sure to create a smooth and gradual line. As for sewing up the garment, I start by sewing the center front and center back seams of the skirt. I use a zigzag stitch because I'm sewing knit fabric, and because this linen knit is rather heavy, not only do I use my dual feed, but also I make sure to direct it with my hand to make sure that it doesn't get pulled or stretched. Then for the bodice, I start by sewing gathering stitches for the front and back along the seams that will connect to the waist pieces. And then I stitch together the shoulder seams. And then hand roll hem the neckline. I know this is a slightly odd order of operation, but trust me, it will make the attachment to the waist piece a lot easier. Then I gather the bottom edges of the bodice pieces and attach them to the waist pieces. And in the same way, the back bodice pieces get attached to the back waist piece. And then that back bodice to waist seam gets reinforced with a ribbon or a binding of some sort to help prevent sagging. Then the skirt front pieces are attached to the waist front piece. And the same with the back. And then the right hand side seam gets sewn all the way from the arm side to the hem. On the left hand side, this only gets sewn from the hip level. So here's the left side, the side what is going to be open, where it's going to be the opening. I am going to bind it in the same ribbon that I used for the waist. So what I'm going to do is all the way here at the hip where it can be closed again, because I don't need that to open. I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to make a little slit here in the seam allowance, but not at where the opening is, but about an inch into the part where it is stitched together already. Now both sides of the seam allowance is covered with that same ribbon or bias binding all the way to that little slit that we cut open. This is going to provide the placket for the opening, and this is also going to stabilize the snap closures that we're going to put in. And here you can see both of those edges bound. This gives a nice clean finish for the garment. Then I add one hook and eye closure at the very top, while the rest of the closures are snaps. Then the hem gets bound in ribbon again, being extra careful that you don't stretch the fabric as you go. And then I fold up the hem 2 inches, making sure that I keep that even all throughout the skirt, and hem in place. And as for the lining dress, it is made up the same way, except that I use a straight stitch, of course, because I'm using a woven fabric. The only difference being that the skirt pieces get top stitched onto the waist pieces instead of sewn together normally. This allows the woven fabrics to drape better and is much easier to sew this way. And here's my finished evening gown. I decided to accessorize it with a clip-on rose like suggested in the pattern, and a Gouda up belt, and a pair of original vintage 1930s heels. And clutch style purses were the most popular in the era. And here you can see that even though my straps are off center, it still doesn't show any visible bra lines. And on top of this, unlike modern strapless bras usually, this is actually really comfortable to wear. If I were to make this again, the only real change I would make to this is that I would probably make the waist a size smaller, because both on the overgown and the underdress, the waist is a tad bit big on me. But luckily the belt fixes that problem. Well, that's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do hit that like button, and if you haven't already subscribed, feel free to do that. And I hope to see you again next time. Bye!